about carb count myself. I asked him to do one session uh, again back from US. So he live streamed it to our patients at our own clinic. I think that was around 6, 7 years
6, 7 years ago.
back. So that was very early period when we were kind of formulating all these like type 1 diabetes
So,
education we were
so
trying to.
of course, I will gain knowledge today when I attend your session. Is carb count the only important thing for diabetes management? I mean, is it that what I've read is that you cannot become zero carb in your diet. So, you know, I
That's
mean, is
correct.
that the most important thing? Everyone
I
says
think
cut down carb, cut down carb.
so. You kind of hit the point on right on the target that carbohydrates are important for living, even if you have type 1 diabetes, and that is why it's important to count your carbs rather than eliminate the carbs from your diet. So I think that's a perfect background for why we need to talk about carb counting, because we cannot manage diabetes without that knowledge.
Yeah, I think Amit, we can start.
Okay. All right. I'll share my screen. Okay. Just confirm that you guys are able to see it.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. Thank you so much. So good morning, everybody. Everybody who's listening here, welcome. Happy Sunday to you. Thank you so much to IAP Speed for inviting me for this talk. And thank you so much for everybody who is giving 1 hour of their Sunday morning towards learning about carbohydrate counting. I'm Amit Lahoti. I'm an associate professor of pediatrics in the division of pediatric endocrinology at Nationwide Children's Hospital and Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, USA. And I'm also the fellowship program director for the 3-year pediatric endocrinology training program here at our hospital. Today, I'll be talking about carbohydrate counting for type 1 diabetes as the next session for the IAP Speed course to keep in continuity about your learning about managing type 1 diabetes in children. So these are the course outlines, background. We'll talk a little bit about carbohydrate counting, why to do carbohydrate counting. Then we'll go on to how to do carbohydrate counting. We'll learn a few nuances like sugar-free foods and glycemic index and their relationship to carbohydrate counting. And then the future of carbohydrate counting, how most of the talk will be about what are we doing currently or what is recommended currently. And then we'll spend a few minutes talking about what is in there for future for carbohydrate counting. One warning is several slides may make you feel hungry, but good thing is you're all going to be having lunchtime soon. So I think this is perfectly timed for most of you. So to talk about background, so in 1993, NEJM published an article, which was now a landmark study in the field of diabetes, the DCCT trial or the Diabetes Control and Complications trial, which proved that intensive therapy, which is 3 or more daily injections of insulin, delays the onset and slows the progression of diabetic microvascular disease, namely retinopathy, nephropathy, and neuropathy in patients with insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus more effectively than what we call the conventional therapy or 1 to 2 daily injections. Now, on this graph, you can see that during the course of the study, in which they followed patients for a long period of time, 10 years, they did show that once the intensive therapy was started, their hemoglobin A1C dropped significantly and was able to be maintained much lower compared to those who followed the conventional regimen. And one of the primary goals of management in type 1 diabetes is to achieve target glycemic control, which is a hemoglobin A1C of less than 7%. And if you are using a continuous glucose monitor to have a time in range of greater than 70% without excessive hypoglycemia. Now, when we talk about hyperglycemia in patients with type 1 diabetes, there is literature which says that there are more than 42 factors which control or which affect your blood sugar levels. Food is something that we most commonly associate as the factors that control your blood sugar, but things like medications, your activity, your biological factors, environmental factors, and behavioral and decision-making factors all affect your blood sugars. Now, we cannot control several of them. Like sometimes you cannot control your mood, which may affect your blood sugar. However, the thing which is most often within our control is what we are eating. And that is why we'll focus our talk today about that aspect of diabetes management, which is our food. So this is the most important factor for controlling your blood sugars, and carbohydrate is the most important food group that affects your blood sugar. Proteins and fats have historically been told as not to affect blood sugars much, but now it has increasingly been recognized that they do probably affect our blood sugars, though to a much significantly lower degree compared to carbohydrates. They, however, when present in food, also affect how the carbohydrates are absorbed and hence can affect the carbohydrates response to your blood sugar also whenever we are eating food which has both carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. A little bit deja vu about our general physiology of carbohydrate metabolism, which we all studied during our MBBS days, I think, is that the food, once it's ingested, the digestion of carbohydrate starts right from the mouth in the salivary, with the help of salivary alpha amylase. And the salivary alpha amylase breaks down your polysaccharides or complex carbohydrates into alpha dextrins. In the stomach acid denatures the amylase enzyme, and the stomach enzyme then further breaks down the carbohydrates, which then reaches the small intestines, where pancreas secretes the enzyme alpha amylase, which starts digesting the alpha dextrins into disaccharides, trisaccharides, and oligosaccharides. And after the food further moves down in the small intestine is where the brush border enzymes of maltase, isomaltase, sucrase, and lactase further break down the disaccharides and trisaccharides into the actual monosaccharide molecules, which are then able to be absorbed into our bloodstream. So as you can see, depending on the sugar we consumed, we can have just glucose fructose, or glucose galactose being absorbed in our bloodstream. The other thing to note here is you don't have to eat sugar to affect your blood sugar. So the food does not have to essentially taste sweet for it to affect your blood sugar. As a matter of fact, almost more than 90% of any kind of carbohydrate you eat eventually gets broken down into sugar in our blood within 1 to 2 hours. It's also important to know that not all foods are created equal. Different foods produce different amount of carbohydrates in our body, which require different amount of insulin. So something like khaman dhokla versus roti versus biryani or jalebi or versus milk. All of these have carbohydrates, but they affect their blood sugars very differently. And what is different about them? The one classification can be considered is classification of carbohydrates into simple and complex carbohydrates. This is probably the most simple classification. It may be a bit oversimplification. We'll talk a little bit about it later. But for the time being, think about simple carbohydrates as the foods which raise our blood sugars fast. They include primarily monosaccharides like glucose, fructose, and galactose. These can be absorbed directly and don't require further digestion. As an example, they do not require breakdown with enzymes, unlike disaccharides and polysaccharides. So things like candy, juice, sugar syrup, cake icing, these all have simple carbohydrates, so rapid to be absorbed. Compare them to complex carbohydrates, which affect the blood sugar only after digestion. Complex carbohydrates are made up of sugar molecules that are strung together in long and complex chains, which basically they're found in foods like roti, bread, milk, whole grains, and vegetables. So just to walk through a few examples, things like brown bread is an example of complex carbohydrates. Candies and sugar and mostly candies will be considered simple carbohydrates. Chocolates, which are milk chocolates, they would have a combination of both simple and complex carbohydrates in them. Talk about some starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, they have complex carbohydrates, but talk about sodas, they are full of simple carbohydrates or ready to absorb carbohydrates. Fruits, they have both complex and simple carbohydrates. But when you make a fruit juice out of a fruit and you take away all the pulp, you are mostly left with simple carbohydrates in the vast majority of the amount. Talk about chapati. It's a complex carbohydrate. Sugar syrup or chashni is a simple carbohydrate. Now, there are foods which are more than just carbs. For example, raita or milk. They have both fat and protein along with carbohydrates in them. Talking about things like khichdi and dal, they also have complex carbohydrates, proteins, and fat. So here's a quick question about it. So we just talked about simple carbohydrates. So something like glucon D, which is just plain glucose, is obviously simple carbohydrates. And we talk about Minute Maid or orange juice. Juices also have simple carbohydrates. So in most patients of type 1 diabetes, you do not want their blood sugar to rise rapidly, except when we are trying to treat a low. So when we are trying to treat a low blood sugar, we do want to get their blood sugar to rise rapidly. And if you want to just think about, now these both are simple carbohydrates, is one better than the other when I'm trying to treat a low blood sugar? So they're very close to each other. But there's at least one study which looked at comparing simple sugar versus juices, and it found that plain glucose tablets are a bit faster in raising the blood sugar than compared to juices. And this makes sense from the physiology which we just studied, because juices will still have sucrose, which will still require some digestion compared to glucose, which is a direct monosaccharide. So glucon D wins, juice comes a close second. Now, talking about carbohydrates and diabetes, how do you manage in practical terms your meals and your insulin with it? Several times we come up with a plan which looks almost like this. You have to eat breakfast at the same time, lunch at the same time, and dinner at this particular time. It has to be this identical looking almost 7 days a week for our management to work. However, when we talk about what happens in reality, we are eating different things, often at different times. Some days we eat an early lunch, some days we eat a late dinner, some days we eat a brunch, some days we eat a lunner. So some days we eat a late night snack. So life is not consistent, especially when we are talking with children. Their meals are often not the same time or the same amount each time they are sitting to eat a meal. Now, I think in the previous sessions, basal bolus therapy has been covered for you all. So you do know that the current standard of care for managing diabetes is using a basal insulin once a day, which provides an insulin coverage for close to 24 hours. And this is primarily useful for the glucose that is coming from the liver. So gluconeogenesis or glycogenolysis, which is happening, that is what the basal insulin covers. And each time we eat a meal, our natural body's instinct is to secrete insulin in a healthy person, which doesn't happen in a patient with type 1 diabetes. So we want to give bolus insulin to cover for those meals. And that is why it's called basal and bolus therapy. Now, you have an option of giving a fixed amount of carbohydrates per meal to a child with basal bolus therapy, so that we say, okay, you eat this many grams of meal each time and you take this much insulin each time. As we just said, that may not always work. So if you prescribe a flexible amount of carbohydrates per meal, you provide that flexibility to the patient. No matter which way you choose, it is important to know to count carbohydrates, because even if you're asking them to keep the fixed amount of carbohydrates, they need to know what are carbohydrates and how to count them for them to be successfully able to follow your regimen. So our own knowledge is important, and then we can impart that knowledge to our patients so that we empower them to be able to make the right treatment decisions for their diabetes. Now, in order to know how to count carbohydrates, a few things will come in handy. And these are things which we are on an average day are not used to using in our kitchen or in our houses, unless you are a baker, because we often are not measuring the food in terms of the way that we need to measure to be able to figure out the amount of carbs, or we are not even looking at the food in the same way. Now, several of you may remember when you were interns in MBBS, and you had started to do blood draws on your patients. Anytime you were in the wards, you were looking for the patient's vein so that you can have an easy blood draw. Now, after that time, no matter whether you were in the wards or in a DTC bus, you would see somebody's arm and you will say, this is a good arm. I can probably get blood draw from that. So I hope something like that will happen after this session today, that every time you see food, you're not gonna just see how delicious it looks, but also you start thinking about, does it have carbs? Does it have more carbs? Does it have less carbs? Because unless you start thinking about it the same way, I don't think your patients would do the same also. So it's a matter of living. And I think just going through that exercise will give you an insight into your patients' lives also, that it's not an easy thing what we are asking our patients to do, but it's doable. It requires constant practice and a strong motivation to do. So these are measuring spoons, which kind of help us measure food in smaller amounts when we are eating something just 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, or 1/2 a teaspoon. These are measuring cups. Now, one important point to understand is a cup when we mention portion sizes is not your teacup. So, or the cups that we usually call in our regular language, because the volume of fluid in those cups is very variable. When we are talking about cups in terms of measurement of food portions, this is a standard size, internationally recognized standard size, which is considered a full cup, a half a cup, or 1/3 cup. So unless you have a measuring cups, you may under or over measure the food that you are thinking you are eating. So measuring cups are important for accurate carb counting, so that you are using an appropriate serving size per label. Compare half a cup to 1 cup of corn. A half cup of corn may be just 15 grams, while the whole cup will be about 30 grams of carbs. And using measuring cups regularly, at least in the beginning, will give you a better sense of the portion sizes you are eating and what is your typical portion size. Are you on an average eating 1 portion of corn or 2 portions of corn whenever you're eating corn, and so forth. There are also these other kind of measuring cups that we have seen, which are measuring cups of glasses, which will help you measure liquids. Are you eating or drinking half a cup of milk, a whole cup of milk? And again, as I said, our regular cups are not the accurate measurement of liquids either. If you don't have a measuring cup or measuring spoons, these are some other ways in which we can kind of close or approximate the amount of the serving size we are eating. Like an end of a thumb is about 1 tablespoon. A fist is about half a cup. A music CD is about 15 grams, or the size of a chapati. A deck of cards is about 4 ounces or 115 grams or 120 grams of meat. Cupped hands is about half a cup of, let's say if you're taking a cupped hands of rice. And 1 cup of milk is about 250 ml. Now, important to know that these estimations are those for an adult person's hands and not for children's hands. And in US, we use the system of ounces, but that's 1 ounce is equivalent to about 30 grams. So I'll leave this slide for people to reference back in future when they're looking at this presentation. But this is also a helpful way to teach your patients until they get measuring cups or measuring spoons in their houses, to start at least getting a sense of what is the portion size they are eating currently. Now, you would have heard the word carbohydrate choices. This has definitely been a language that has been used for a long time. And 1 carbohydrate choice is basically equivalent to 15 grams of carbohydrates. That was just an early way to start measuring the amount of carbohydrates somebody was eating. So for example, if 1 medium-sized apple has 23 grams of carbs, it is about 1.5 choice. 1 apple sauce, half a cup, has about 12 carbs, so it's roughly about 1 choice. 1 large banana has about 27 grams of carbs, so it's about 1.8 choices. So people measured their food in terms of either grams of carbs or the choices of carbohydrates, where 1 choice is equivalent to 15 grams of carbs. Now, this food labels used to be almost non-existent in India, at least some time ago. Over the last 4 or 5 years or 10 years or so, you are probably increasingly noticing that the prepackaged food industry has been beginning to now put more specific nutrition labels on Indian foods also, whether we're talking about snacks or pre-prepared foods or frozen meals. And each of them would have a serving size in them, which is based on a one serving. And the total carbohydrates are mentioned on it. So it's important to note what you are supposed to read on the nutrition label when you're figuring out how to count the carbohydrates and determining the carbohydrate amounts with various serving sizes. So as I earlier said, depending on how many servings you are eating, you may have to double or half the amount that's listed in the nutrition label as a serving size. So for example, in this nutrition label, the serving size here says 1 ounce or about 28 grams or about 21 pieces. So if you end up eating 42 pieces, you are eating 2 serving sizes. So whatever the amount of carbohydrates this says, you have to multiply that by 2. Or if you are eating just half of that, then you divide it by 2. And the other important part of the nutrition label, at least for our purposes for this talk, is the total carbohydrate. This is another take-home message for everybody listening, is when you're looking at the carbohydrate count of prepackaged foods, do not look at just the sugars. Look at the total carbohydrates right here, because your body will need insulin for the entire carbohydrates, not just for sugar. So that's an important one to recognize. Now, what we do commonly talk or teach our patients is cups, pieces, chips or crackers, number of chips or number of crackers, and tablespoons. Ounces and grams of actual food item is most patients have hard time following it. So what we try to teach them is the things which they are going to probably be able to do on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes you do have to ask them to measure food in grams and kind of understand how much carbohydrate that will eventually equate to, especially home cooked food sometimes. However, the other alternative of using the measuring cups and measuring spoons is also a very good alternative if they are able to get to use them consistently. Now, one thing which we often struggle is to give resources to our patients of how to find out the carbohydrates once they have arranged a plate or made a plate for themselves. So there are a lot of resources for diets which are outside of India, because people have written a lot about it. There are a lot of resources, a lot of apps, a lot of textbooks that have been written on it. For Indian foods, I think still, despite the number of diabetes patients that we have in the country, I think it's amazing how we do not have enough resources for our patients, which are as easily or freely available. It was sort of disheartening actually for me to see that the most of the easily available resources are coming from US for Indian diets, which is I think a space where there's a vacuum and needs to be filled. I think there needs to be created more resources for Indian diets in a lot of Indian languages where patients who need them can actually use them. All these resources are in English. We need to create resources which are easy to read for our patients. But at least for you as an educator, I think these are excellent resources. And again, these links will be there with you at the end of the presentation. So feel free to access them and keep them handy, because several of them actually have pictures and several of them go through a lot of regional varieties of foods that we currently have in India to provide some information to your patient in whichever part of the country you are in. So now putting carb counting to practice, as I said, this is how your plate will look like starting today. You will not just see the food, but also will start identifying what has carbs, what has more carbs and less carbs on your plate. And this is what we are asking our patients to do when we are asking them to do carb counting, is to exactly look at their plate and then give each food item a number based on the amount of carbohydrates it has. Now, this was another important example that just having 2 idlis on your plate does not always mean the same amount of carbohydrates, because it depends on the size of idlis. And this was a good example because homemade idlis are typically smaller than a restaurant idlis. And so the restaurant idlis, the same 2 idlis may have about 15 grams of carbs each, compared to a homemade idli has about 7.5 grams of carbs each. And as you can imagine, a person with diabetes who needs maybe roughly about 1 unit of insulin for about 8 grams of carbs will need double the amount of insulin if he's eating the same 2 idlis in the restaurant versus 2 idlis at home. So hence it's important to know not only the food item and how much carbs does it have, the size and the portion control. Once again, we were talking about the portions earlier. That is why it's important to learn and know about it, because your food selection as well as when you are dosing for your insulin matters, will be dependent on it. Now, I think in the previous sessions, you guys have covered or have probably listened to it. And if you have not had a chance to listen to it, please go ahead and listen to those earlier sessions which covered this concept in greater detail. But I will just use these concepts today to practice some of it, what we've just talked about, which is essentially insulin to carbohydrate ratio. So when we are using multiple daily injections or intensive insulin regimen, what we are basically saying, you need insulin for 2 parts of your meal, 2 parts of two things primarily. You're covering your carbohydrates and for your blood sugar. So when you are using figuring out how much insulin to give for the food I eat, you use you figure out 1 unit of insulin, which is your rapid-acting insulin, Novolog or Humalog, is needed for how many grams of carbohydrates. That is your insulin to carbohydrate ratio. So to get an example, for this particular patient, let's say 1 unit of insulin is needed for every 15 grams of carbohydrates. Now, this is a number that is going to be individualized for your own patient. So this is just an example. So if the patient had 60 grams of carbohydrates, he will need 4 units of insulin. He had 30 grams of carbohydrates, he'll need 2 units of insulin, and so on and so forth. The other thing that he'll need insulin is as a correction factor, which will be used to correct for a high blood sugar level before a meal, and 1 unit for every X milligram per deciliter of your blood sugar above the target. So for most patients in our practice, patients have a target of about 120 milligram per deciliter as their blood sugar target. And so, for example, if we say this particular patient has a correction factor of 50, so 1 unit for every 50 points of blood sugar over 120. Let's say his blood sugar is 170. I will subtract the 120 from the 170, which will give me 50. And then 50 divided by 50 will give me 1 unit. So essentially, I'll need to give him 1 unit extra for the blood sugar. So he's sitting down to eat a meal. I'll find out the amount of insulin he needs for his carbohydrates. I'll find out the insulin, how much he will need for his correction. And then I add the two to figure out how much insulin he should take before he starts eating a meal. Now, you may not need to calculate a correction dose if your blood sugar is within the normal range. And if you need to correct, add the correction dose to the amount calculated to cover your carbs, which we just talked about. Now, let's say we'll talk about, again, one of the examples that we just said is if the blood sugar before lunch is, let's say, 200, subtract the target blood sugar from the blood sugar, which will be 200 minus 120 gives us 80, divide by the correction factor, which in this case is about 40, gives about 2 units, and round to the nearest 2 units. So insulin dose is insulin for the carbohydrates plus insulin for blood glucose. If the patient needed 6 units for his carbs, you add the 2 units for the blood sugar, and the total insulin the patient should take is about 8 units. This is another example for a person who has a blood sugar of 200. His insulin to carb ratio is 1 unit for every 12 grams of carbs and a correction factor of 40. Eating 1 roti, which is about 15 grams of carbs, half a cup of dal, it is equivalent to 15 grams of carbs, beans about half a cup, 15 grams, salad and tomato and cucumber, which has about 4.5 grams of carbs, and rice, which is about 22.5 grams of carbs. So the plate looks like this. The total amount of grams are about 72 grams of carbs divided by 12, which is his insulin to carbohydrate ratio, to give you 6.25, and we rounded up to 6 units. And we just added the 6 plus 2 to give us 8 units of insulin. Now, that was a discussion about meals. We also don't just survive on meals. We also do snack frequently in between our meal times. So how about snacks? So meal times typically based on the current eating habits. However, if there is greater than 4 hours in between meals, it is recommended to add a snack, typically restricted to about 15 grams of carbs. For larger snacks, a child may need insulin. And this number of 15 grams of carbs is nothing magical about it. It entirely depends on the child's age and the child's insulin needs. So When a child is younger, the insulin to carbohydrate ratio is typically over 15. So they typically need 1 unit of insulin for, let's say, 20 grams of carbs or 25 grams of carbs. So 15 grams of carbs is typically less than 1 unit. And that is why we say, okay, up to 15 grams of carbs is probably free snack for you. You don't have to take insulin for it. But as the same child gets into a teenager and an older person, he may start needing 1 unit for every 5 grams of carbs or 7 grams of carbs. So then 15 grams of carbs is actually equal to about 2 or 3 units worth of insulin for him. So this 15 grams doesn't remain like a free snack for everybody. It entirely depends on your patient's insulin needs, and this changes. And if the patient is eating a larger snack or is eating a regular size snack but has strong insulin to carb ratios, he will need insulin for even for a snack. So some tips for snack is know your portion sizes beforehand. And if you aren't sure, use measuring cups and spoons. One advice that I typically give to my patients with diabetes for snacks is try to pre-portion the snack and keep it in small Ziploc bags or boxes. Because if you just buy a big bag of chips or big bag of crackers or a box full of Matris, then when you are hungry, you are probably not going to be sitting and counting how many Matris I'm eating. You are just hungry and you're going to just eat. If, on the other hand, you have pre-portioned them, that your portion size of a snack for you is 2 Matris or 3 Matris, and we keep that as a separate snack, separate in Ziploc bag or in a box, then when I'm hungry, I'm just taking one portion, and I know this is my appropriate size of a snack for me. Don't forget to count the carbohydrates into your overall meal plan for a snack if you're using carb counting. Avoid mindless snacking in front of TV or computer or while reading or driving. And stock up on healthy options so you always have healthy snack options on hand. Here are some examples of snacks which have less than 5 grams of carbs, so they can help you fill up without necessarily needing an insulin each time you eat them or snack on them. Some examples are 15 almonds, 1 hard-boiled egg, 5 baby carrots, 1 cup of cucumber slices, plus 1 tablespoon of ranch dressing. Again, these are examples, several of them from my patients here in the United States. But again, we need to customize it and kind of create a list of the snacks that our patients in India might frequently be eating so that we can give them some suggestions on easy to eat snacks which are not so high in carbohydrates. And then there are snacks which are about 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrates. As kids become a teenager and they are kind of their caloric needs increase, they are often wanting to eat more in between meals. A child with diabetes is no different in that regard. A child with diabetes actually also needs the same amount of calories for their growing body's needs. So to restrict them that you cannot have a big snack because you have diabetes actually may stunt their growth and actually may make them start sneaking food sometimes because they are going to be hungry. They will have to fill up their stomach. So in those cases, we often recommend that they should eat a proper sized snack, which will be like a mini meal, but they will just need insulin for it. So don't restrict them into very small snacks at that age because their body needs more. Now, a couple kind of talking points about what are sugar-free snacks or sugar-free foods or no sugar added foods. This is another take-home message I want all the audience to take home today is these foods may still contain a significantly large amount of carbohydrates. And just because of big, large label on the packet, which says it is sugar-free, does not mean it is carbohydrate-free. So for example, this sugar-free apple pie still has carbohydrates from the apple that it contains and the crust of the pie. This sugar-free pudding in this nutrition label you can see has no sugar in it, but it still has 8 grams of carbohydrates from the milk that was used to create the pudding. So always remember, all sugar-free foods are not carbohydrate-free foods. They may still have carbohydrates. Now, I'll spend a couple slides talking about glycemic index. We hear this word frequently being used, especially in health-conscious patients, especially in adult patients. But how does it pertain to insulin dosing for patients with type 1 diabetes? So we earlier learned about the classification of dividing carbohydrates into simple and complex carbohydrates. It is a bit oversimplified classification. However, because not all complex carbohydrates are the same, and to explain how different kinds of carbohydrate-rich foods directly affect the blood sugar, the glycemic index was developed as a scale. Now, the glycemic index scale goes from 0 to 100 based on how quickly and how much they raise the blood sugar levels after eating. High glycemic index foods like white bread rapidly are digested and cause substantial fluctuations in blood sugar. Low glycemic index foods like whole oats essentially are whole grain foods. They are digested more slowly, prompting a more gradual rise in blood sugar. The same difference we talk about between maida and atta. I think maida is a high glycemic index and whole wheat atta is a low glycemic index food comparatively. Now, to talk about the exact number, if the glycemic index is 55 or less, it's considered low glycemic index food. Medium is somewhere between 56 to 69, and high glycemic index are foods that have a score of 70 to 100. Now, literature is limited on the contribution of glycemic index to overall glycemic control in patients with type 1 diabetes. There were a couple of studies that I do want to quote and bring up for discussion here is that this one was from 2009, the effect of a low glycemic diet versus a standard diet on blood glucose levels and macronutrient intake in children with type 1 diabetes. And it was a pilot study, relatively small study, but they concluded that a low glycemic diet was associated with improved diet quality and a reduction in hyperglycemia. There's a more recent paper on this, which is a review paper looking at multiple studies that have been done, very recently published, diet and glycemic index in children with type 1 diabetes. And the authors concluded that the results are promising and demonstrate that diets promoting low glycemic index foods guarantee a greater glycemic stability with a reduction in postprandial hyperglycemic peaks. However, one of the main limitations is represented by the poor adherence of children to a healthy diet. So constantly just having low glycemic foods is not practically possible. So what I think we should ask our patients and families to aim for is go for more foods with low glycemic index while they minimize the foods with higher glycemic index because it is not possible to completely eliminate them. All right, this is towards the end of the presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the future. Just 2 days ago in our division, we had a demonstration of this, one of the newest insulin pumps. Several of you have probably heard of insulin pumps, may have seen insulin pumps. There are several in US market. A few of them are also in Indian market available. This is islet bionic pancreas. This is one of the latest insulin pumps in the market right now. And what makes this very unique compared to the previous pumps is it makes a further step in making the technology which decreases the burden of disease management in patients with type 1 diabetes. So we have had now for past few years what we call hybrid closed loop insulin pumps, which basically have an insulin pump and a CGM, which kind of talk to each other. And so the CGM continuously measures the blood sugars and the pump continuously delivers insulin. However, the insulin pump listens to the CGM in the way that if the blood sugar is rising, the pump can give automatically some extra insulin, or if the blood sugar is dropping too fast, the pump can actually auto shut off and prevent a hypoglycemic episode from happening. Now, this takes us that step further because in the current most hybrid closed loop systems, you still have to count the carbs and tell the pump what you are eating because it cannot auto bolus for a whole meal. If you eat without telling the pump what you're eating, you will just have a big spike of insulin because it cannot adjust for that spike happening. This islet bionic pancreas pump is special because the only thing we need to enter into the pump is the patient's weight. We don't have to enter the basal insulin rate, the carbohydrate ratio, or the correction factor. Once we have put the patient's weight into the pump, the patient starts the insulin pump, and then the pump is only waiting to hear from you if you are eating a meal. It doesn't want you to count carbs. It just wants to tell you, are you eating a regular sized meal? If I'm sitting for lunch, is this my regular size lunch? I'm eating a mega meal or I'm eating very little. So a lower than average or a higher than average meal. And then the pump takes it from there. The pump will deliver insulin for your bolus, for your meal. For that particular meal, it will continue to deliver a basal insulin. It can give an extra bolus if it underestimated how many carbs you ate. So this is a state-of-the-art technology that is now available to several patients. We haven't started putting any of our patients yet, but we are probably going to in the next few months start to do this. However, one caveat to this system is that this is obviously waiting to hear things from the CGM. It is entirely dependent on the blood sugar level that the CGM is reading and telling the pump what the blood sugars are reading. Technology is, after all, technology. It can fail. So there are times when the pump may have a malfunction and pump may stop, or the patient may not want the CGM and may take it off, or the patient may have a long gap between replacing a CGM. So if there is no CGM signal coming, this pump does not really know what the blood sugar is doing, and the pump goes on a limited mode for about 72 hours, where it asks you to continue to check blood sugar and tell you what your blood sugar is, but eventually it's going to stop. And that's when, again, the return back to basics comes into picture. So for the foreseeable future, the skill of learning to carbohydrate counting, even if you are going to be in the most advanced technology, is not a wasted skill. This is a skill that even the patients who are on the most advanced technology may need to resort to at times when technology fails, or as an alternative when they are not able to use the technology. So I hope by the end of this presentation, you all listening are convinced that there is a need for us to understand carbohydrate counting and teach our patients carbohydrate counting so that they can better manage their diabetes. Because without this skill, we are never going to be able to reach our target glucose control of a hemoglobin A1C of less than 7% without excessive hypoglycemias, and keep these children who have a long life ahead of them as healthy as possible and prevent complications from them. So thank you everyone for listening. You soon will be able to enjoy your lunch, and hopefully you will give carbohydrate counting a try. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Amit. Yeah, over to Dr. Rajiv for questions. Attendees can pose their questions in Q&A section.
Okay, so Amit, maybe you can stop your slide share now. I think you have
Sure,
done
yes.
slides. Yeah. Then we'll be able to see each other. Yeah. So Amit, I think couple of comments first, and maybe a question before we go ahead and do our audience question is on carbohydrate count resources. I must say that I also thought that there are no Indian resources for carb counting, but there is a very good book published by NIN Hyderabad, National
Okay,
Institute of Nutrition. We have it has got an extensive list of carb counting in for Indian foods.
that's
So
good. Very good to
it's
hear.
not available. It's not available online, but anybody can get hold of this book very easily.
Good,
Uh, in our own experience, it is not, I would say, not 100% infallible, but it's a good reference book for us to go through, and then we can couple of changes we can do. Then there are a lot of apps now we have, Healthify Me and all those stuff. So they've got a lot of these Indian food. Again, not 100% infallible, but for daily routine use, they are good enough,
good
right?
enough. Good to know.
And adding that, Google and Chat GPT again are pretty good resources for you to get any carb in any food. This thing. So you will not have a list, but then you can always ask them as you
Correct.
need, right?
Yeah,
Uh, yeah. Second thing, again, I think we were discussing this before we started this session. Before you started this session, is generally what I realized was I also went through a lot of this literature and convinced was convinced that carbohydrate count is needed. Now the problem that I faced, and I believe a lot of our listeners face, is now somebody has come to your clinic you have to explain it to them. Okay, this carb counting is to be done. Now the problem here is, as you said, you don't have a list which you can say, okay, go ahead and see this carb. Now half of our population uh, uh, doesn't kind of can't do proper reading and everything. They've got limited resources, they've got limited time. So generally it becomes very challenging to tell them, okay, go ahead, you've got this plate of food, and then tell me how many carbs are there in this case, right? And then, given the fact that the portion sizes would also vary, as you said, and then we have to use those kitchen scales and weighing measures. But how do, first of all, how do you practically do it in your own clinic? So like, I believe that a lot of things can be done in their way, and then what do you suggest, how do we do it in our own clinic? Say I'm sitting here, I've never done carb counting before with my patients. How do I go about it in my own clinic?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Rajiv. So, couple of things. Let me start with how we do it here. So we are, I think one thing we is important for us all physicians to realize, and I don't know if there are other non-physician members on this platform also today, is that managing diabetes in children is very difficult to do as a one-man show. So we as physicians alone cannot do a great job managing diabetes. We have limitation of time. We have limitation, frankly, of knowledge also. I have not read dietetics. I am not an expert by any means on figuring out carbohydrates for meals or advising diet to my patients. That is a role for which a dietitian does specialist training to be able to advise that. So I by no means pretend to be a dietitian to my patients, and I use my resources to help my patients in a whole-hearted manner. So I think if possible, and if your patients can afford it, getting them to take the help of a dietitian is a great tool to have. Now, if your dietitian by themselves may not know carbohydrate counting or do not teach carbohydrate counting, that is something you will have to work with your dietitian to help them get up to speed. But frankly speaking, trust me, they will be much easier for them to learn this than you and I would. So utilizing your colleagues in managing diabetes is one of the important tools to do. So we have in our team, we typically have a dietitian whom the patients meet at diagnosis. And they typically have a 2 to 4 hour session with the educator and with the nutritionist for about 1 to 2 hours, where the nutritionist tells them or the dietitian tells them about how to identify carbohydrates, kind of the summary of what I talked about today, and then gives them resources. The second thing is we don't expect our patients to be expert at it from diagnosis itself. It is an acquired skill. As I said, most of us don't look at a food and count carbohydrates in it. I cannot expect my patient to start doing just because their child now has diabetes. So, but that doesn't stop them from beginning to count carbohydrates from day one. Will it be perfect? No, but I never let perfect be the enemy of good. So even if they are average in just kind of figuring out their carbohydrates, they are off by 5 or 10 points or 15, 20 points, I think they will learn. So this is a long journey which just starts at the diabetes diagnosis and doesn't finish there. And then our patients kind of on their appointments, at least we try to get them to see a dietitian once a year on their follow-up appointments to kind of touch base on things. Now, to comment about a couple resources, I'm glad to hear that there are other resources that are available in India now which I was not able to find. And thanks, Dr. Rajiv, for pointing that out for our listeners. Be careful about Google and ChatGPT because you will probably find the same amount or same food that you are going to enter will have anywhere from plus minus 10, 15 grams of carbs or even more because the size of the food is there's no way for them to say sometimes unless you clarify it. So just be careful if you're interpreting it, just be careful. It's a good resource, but be careful about interpreting it. Now, in terms of using it for your patient population, I think the first step of the way is to convince your patient that this is needed. So once the patient has a buy-in into that, yes, I need to learn this to be able to better manage my child with diabetes, there's a better chance. I was able to manage diabetes for a 2.5-year-old girl in Odisha through a dietitian that I was working with. So that patient was primarily the patient of a dietitian, and she consulted me to kind of help with insulin dose adjustment. But that dietitian had worked well with that patient well enough that that mom understood that she needs to count carbohydrates, and the diet plan that the dietitian had given to her will only work if she is going to practice counting carbohydrates on the child. So my making insulin dose adjustments made sense in those patients because then I knew at least that part was taken care of. So once your patient has an understanding and buy-in into it, that's probably step number one. Number two, it may not happen from, again, at diagnosis. It may take 4 or 5 visits for you to get the patient to a point that they are able to count carbohydrates and use them. If they're not able to read, we have some patients also who are not able to read or not able to do math, frankly speaking. And sometimes pictures work for them. So we kind of sometimes print out pictures of foods and kind of put together how much 1 calorie of this or 1 cup of this is equal to this many grams of carbs. Or sometimes we convert that into units of insulin for them while we do the math on our end. So if we say 1 calorie is equal to 15 grams of carbs and that is equal to 1 unit of insulin, we just directly write 1 calorie is equal to 1 unit of insulin. So at least they are getting the right amount of insulin for the food that they are eating, even if they're not, quote unquote, measuring or counting the carbs, because we did it for them. This is another place where I feel technology can be a really good friend for us. So again, OpenAI or AI, now there is visual identification of food. There are apps that can be developed now. This is, I think, the need of the hour, that we need to, I think carbohydrate counting is a labor intensive way. And I think we need to make it easier than what it is right now. I think there's a need to create apps. Several of our patients, even in India, even if they cannot read, they have a phone and they often have a smartphone with a camera on it. So if we have an app that can point to a food and count carbohydrates for them, bingo, they don't have to do it. So I think until we get to that point, using the resources that we have and taking some time for them to get there is a goal. Question is whether we do a counting or not is not really the question. Can we do it today or in 4 visits is the question. So I think we need to all be, number one, agree that this is a needed skill. It may take us time to get there and we need to find different ways of managing diabetes until that time, but this is something that will be needed.
Yeah, I think, so that's a good explanation. I think the way I was talking to you, so we are a resource crunch country. So I can tell you that 90% of people who are listening to it will not have a support of a dedicated dietitian, and let alone a dietitian
Who manages that?
who's expert
Correct.
in type 1 diabetes, right? So dietitian may still be there, but people who can manage type 1 diabetes is still a more rarity. So as I was telling you, I'm just repeating it for our listeners' sake as to how do we do at our own clinic is, because what I've realized mostly is it eventually would fall on physicians to do it on their own, whatever limited time they have with patients. So the practical steps to do with is, first of all, is to start with uh, objectifying their food, in the sense that, say, step one is to ask them to write whatever they are eating. So I'm eating, say, 2 chapatis at breakfast and then, say, a katori of dal and a katori of curd. We do that ways. Once they are well versed in that, once we've kind of made it a system that they're writing their blood glucose, they're writing their insulin, they're writing their food. In second step, we ask them to buy a kitchen scale and all the scales that you said them, take a measuring cup and take a scale. And then we start asking them to convert those measurements into grams. So say my 1 katori, whatever their katori is, that my katori holds, say, 100 grams of dal or 50 grams of dal or 60 grams of dal. Then they start doing it as a second step. And third step is when we ask them to convert this, once we are sure that now they are well versed with this thing. And we also tell them that, see, eventually, whatever food you are eating in a week, in a month, they are going to be maximum 50 food items. They're not going to be more than 50 in any case. And they're going to repeat over and over and over and over again. So you just need to look at 50 food items. It is not that tough. Once they start measuring grams, then we start asking, okay, now start converting them into carbs and bring it back to us. And then we verify. So whatever source, if they use some app, if they use anything, then we verify it at our own clinic through our own diet counselor. Okay, now this need to be corrected. Use this reference sheet. we start making a reference sheet for them. And once they've done it, again, in the next step, we start linking their carbs with their insulin. Then we start explaining them, okay, so see these grams of carbs, this much of insulin you took, and this looks like a good day. This looks like your carb ratio. And then you start modifying based upon different days. Then you start an insulin carb ratio, and then you start modifying that now, because yeah, that carb counting is set. And what you said is absolutely right. I can tell you this one teacher whose daughter had this type 1 diabetes. She lives in Jammu in a remote village, and she came once, and then we connected through internet. Now 6 months down the line, she doesn't have to count carbs. She can look at the plate and tell you how many carbs are there. She doesn't need to look at each granular thing, because she's done it over 3 6 months. Now she knows. And we tell people to teach children as well. Tell them that this much is the carbs that you are eating. They may not do a calculation, they may not sound interested, but once you start doing it every day, then eventually in a couple of years, children would have same amount of knowledge as their parents would have. So I think so that's where you start. And then of course, if you've got a resource which can help you, and of course, I have a lot of those resources, a lot of couple of dietitians at our clinic who helps us making this database and list and everything. And we also are kind of and we would be talking about it in later sessions, but we are trying to put this app on a Play Store maybe in a couple of weeks, where we would have this database, verified database of Indian foods, where people would be able to enter their food and get their exact carb counts as to what their carb count is. And perhaps would also try to kind of automate their insulin carb ratios. We would have to work with physicians in that, but it's going to be on Play Store in a couple of weeks, and we of course would let the group know about that is. And then last thing before I take up questions is I'm also going to share a few resources in the group where we've got these Indian snacks, 5-gram carbohydrate snacks, and then 10-gram carbohydrate snacks, and 15-gram carbohydrate snacks that we prepared for our patients, that I'll share in the group so that everybody can go ahead and use those snack ideas for type 1 diabetes children.
Yeah, having lists like that pre-printed and available in your clinic, in your busy
Yes.
clinic, is very helpful. That we also
Absolutely.
find that it is easy to give to the patient, even if you're not able to talk a lot with the patient at that time, at least they have a resource that they can refer back to when they're at home.
Right. Okay, so a question to you. Somebody is asking, what is the name of future insulin pump available only in US? Kindly spell and tell current cost.
Yeah, so cost is a very good question. I don't think that's gonna be a practically helpful number for you, because none of our patients pay the entire cost of the pump out of their own pocket, because they are going to be covered by some kind of an insurance. If they don't have their own insurance, typically the government sponsored insurance is going to be covering after diabetes diagnosis for all patients. So the cost is not very helpful, because that's not something that people do cover out of the pocket. And you can, even if you pay a one-time price of the pump out of the pocket, you will not be able to keep up with the daily needs, because this is not a one-time investment. You need the insulin supplies on an ongoing basis, which are going to be expensive and not doable unless you have some kind of an insurance coverage. Now, the pump is called iLet, I-L-E-T, Bionic Pancreas, or Beta Bionics, B-E-T-A, Bionic is the name of the company, Beta Bionic, and the pump is called iLet. And that's the one that I showed you the picture of.
Right. So then somebody is asking, kindly share name of carb counting book by NI in Hyderabad. I think exact name I don't have at back of my mind. I'll let the group know as to what that exact name is, and then if I can get hold of that book, then I'll maybe snap a photo and then share the cover of the book in the group itself. Can't we just rely on blood sugars done before meals without doing carb counts?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm glad somebody actually asked that. And that basically you're alluding to is why do we even bother with carbohydrate counting? Why don't we just manage the blood sugars? So imagine you're sitting down for a meal and your blood sugar is right now, let's say, very normal. It's 120, and that's at your target range. You're eating a very nice poha jalebi breakfast and you want to eat it. And you said, okay, for my blood sugar, I really don't need insulin, so I can just eat it. Come lunchtime, your blood sugar will be 400, definitely for the carbs that you ate without any insulin. Now you say, okay, all right, this is probably what my breakfast did. I will take insulin for this blood sugar now, and then I can eat my lunch. Come dinner time, believe it or not, your blood sugar will still be 400 because you did not cover for your lunch. So this is like just chasing your tail. And as a result, at least for 16 to 18 hours of the day, you will just run high. Your blood sugar is not going to come down and your hemoglobin A1C will stay high because we do need insulin. Physiologically, you do need insulin for both the food that you eat and for the sugar that is being put out by your liver. So if you do not cover your food, you are losing a big factor that is going to affect your blood sugar and you'll not be able to achieve target blood sugar control.
Right. And sometimes it also happens the other way around also, in the sense that we've seen that in a lot of children or parents, because they're chasing these sugar values, each value they keep on increasing their insulin dose, thinking that more and more is required. Eventually they starts ending up with hypoglycemia between meals. They starting eating more, and then there is no, as you said, you just chasing your tail. There is no end to this cycle then. So what we need to do is we need to be a little more objective and precise in kind of matching our food with the dose that we are requiring. I think another great question for you, uh, uh, Amit, is how can we do carb counting for toddlers? As sometimes they don't eat uniformly.
Yeah,
So how do
that's a
we manage them?
very good question. I can tell you you're not alone in being challenged by this patient population. This remains one of the most difficult to manage patient population, even for us with all the resources that we have. So what we are, I'll tell you if, and so what we are trying to do now for most of our toddlers is trying to put them on insulin pump as soon as possible, because the amount of insulin you can give with an insulin pump is much smaller. You can do 1/10 of a unit or even lesser than that. So you're able to, if they just eat, let's say 5 bites of something, you can potentially give insulin for that. If they eat a whole plate, you can give insulin for that. So before insulin pump, when we were still doing with injections, the control for these patients still remains poor because of the very reason that you just say that. And actually in those patients, sometimes the only thing we are able to do is to correct their blood sugars. And that is why their A1C stays high. We do worry more about hypoglycemia in this patient population, slightly more than hyperglycemia, at least traditionally, because they are unable to speak much. They may have hypoglycemia unawareness, that they may not be able to recognize their low blood sugar levels. So we do tolerate slightly higher blood sugars if we do not have an insulin pump in these patients because of the just nature of their age. But yeah, in those patients, carb counting is still helpful. You can give carb counting to the patients, but several times the parents may not be able to give an insulin dose based on their carb ratios because they just eat much smaller amounts. And in those cases, at least they should be correcting their blood sugars to kind of prevent it from staying high.
Okay, so another question as a sequel to this, Amit, from my side is, so do toddlers kind of do well on insulin pump, in the sense logistically speaking? So don't they do take off their pumps?
Yeah,
How do you ensure
the
it stays on their body?
great question.
So,
So the kind of insulin pump that works best for toddlers is the wireless one, which we call the Omnipod insulin pump. The youngest patient I have put on Omnipod was a 9-month-old baby. So there's limited places on their body. They just don't have enough body fat, frankly. So we are able to put it on their buttocks or on their thighs or on the back of their arms. There are binders or tapes that come with in the market that we are able to put on the pump so that the child does not tug at it or pull at it. So, and it takes a few weeks. And I think once the child gets used to it, they stop pulling it up. But first few times, yes, it will happen that accidentally parents pull it out or the patient pulls it out. But after a few weeks, both the patient and the child get more and more used to it. And tends to work very well.
So when you use pump in toddlers, do you always use CGM or kind of you use it without CGM as well?
No, so almost all our patients currently are the CGM use in our patients with type 1 diabetes right now in our clinic is over 95%. So almost all our patients have a CGM in use currently. And so the before the hybrid closed loop system of insulin pump, where the pump and CGM talk together, came around, the evidence where pump truly helped in improving glycemic control was wishy-washy. But now with the hybrid closed loop system, there is no doubt that you have a much better blood sugar control than you have with injections or even with pump without the CGM. So there's no point of using it without CGM anymore. Frankly, if there is one intervention that I would like to do for a patient with type 1 diabetes, will actually not be an insulin pump. It will be a CGM. The CGM would be a much more helpful tool for parents. Several parents are able to sleep at night for the first time as they have a CGM. Just mere awareness of their blood sugar will be able to help them take care of it. Even if their carb counting was not perfect, if they know the blood sugar is rising to 400 after they ate a meal, they can at least take an action based on the CGM. So a CGM provides a lot more benefit early on before if they're not able to take an insulin pump.
Right. Great. Yeah. So another, I think the last question from audience is does cooking change carb or food items as uncooked or boiled veggies or cheese that's grilled versus ungrilled?
So that's a good question. So to my knowledge, boiling veggies or kind of cooking the cheese does not change their carbohydrate amount. The carbohydrate amount will be dependent on the quantity of food. So dry dal versus a cooked dal of 1 cup, yes, there will be a difference in the amount of carbohydrates in your cup, whether it is dry versus cooked. But the actual cooking process does not change the carbohydrate amount.
Absolutely, because you are adding water, you are adding more veggies, you are adding more gravy, which may not have as much carbs as actual dal would have. So when you're counting carbs, a katori of cooked dal versus a katori of uncooked dal would definitely have different carbs, but that's by weight of actual dal that you used, not by the cooking that you
Correct.
used. Yes, I think those are the questions that were in my mind and in audience mind, I think. Dr. Bela, your comments, please.
Excellent session. Learned a lot. I just want to know, of course, we were talking about diabetes type 1. One is how much of this is extrapolated to diabetes type 2. And secondly, because we have family members who are diabetics. Then secondly, these protein bars are available, now they are a fad, 8-gram protein bar, 20-gram protein. So, and they are supposed to be multigrain, sugar-free. So are they really useful?
So good question. So to answer your first question about how does this information apply to patients with type 2 diabetes? So extremely well. So I think awareness of carbohydrates, of what their intake is actually an equally important skill for a patient with type 2 diabetes also, even if they're not on insulin. One of the goals of managing patients with type 2 diabetes is weight management. And I think carbohydrate control is a very important skill for weight management. Several of our patients with, and I see a fair number of patients with type 2 diabetes in pediatrics. Almost 1 out of every 3 patients that I see with diabetes in pediatrics has type 2 in our patient population. And so weight management by carb control in those patients is an important skill that our dietitians teach them. So this is going to be very important for those patients as well. And the thing that I mentioned about glycemic index, it's actually very important for patients with type 2 diabetes even more, because foods which are high in glycemic index have been associated with more inflammation and more hyperinsulinism in those patients and insulin resistance. So changing their diet to foods which are lower in glycemic index may actually delay the need of insulin in several type 2 diabetes patients. To answer a second question about these protein bars, yes, they are definitely available and they're very ubiquitous now, whichever store or brand you look for. I think one general rule of thumb, which I often tell my patients, is the more number of ingredients your food, number one, even before we reach for ingredients, foods which have labels may not be as healthy as food without labels. So just to give an example, fresh fruits and vegetables do not carry labels on their nutrition component, and they are sometimes the healthiest than the packaged food items that we get in the store. Secondly, the more ingredients that your packaged food item has, the chances of it being healthy is lower and lower, because the extra stuff that is being added to your ingredient list is more likely preservatives and other things which are probably not what you need. So a lesser, shorter ingredient list with lesser preservatives is the way to go. Now, eating, generally speaking, vegetarian diet is relatively very poor in protein. I'm a vegetarian too. I do eat eggs, but other than that, the only other protein source I have is kind of other dairy, so paneer and milk. So Indian vegetarian diet is relatively poor in protein intake, and proteins are an important role for several aspects. Number one, it keeps you full for a bit longer. So patients with type 2 diabetes benefit from eating adequate amount of protein because they don't eat as much food after that. Even patients with type 1 diabetes slow down the absorption of their carbohydrates if they have protein and healthy fat in their diet. So having protein in diet is important. If you cannot get adequate protein naturally in your diet, then a protein bar may be a good alternative to supplement proteins. It's never a replacement for your dietary proteins. One other place where these protein bars are often helpful is a nighttime snack. So when we are trying to prevent the blood sugars from dropping overnight, we typically ask our patients to eat foods which have not just carbohydrates, but some protein and fat. So several of our patients, I recommend them if they can have milk with crackers or peanut butter with crackers and milk. And sometimes I tell them if you have a protein bar, you can eat a protein bar as a bedtime snack, because that helps sustain your blood sugars overnight and prevents that from developing hypoglycemia.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Oh, excellent knowledge gained by
Yeah,
all
that
of
was
us. Lovely.
really an informative session. Really excellent insight into the carbs counting and management of type 1 diabetes. My heartfelt gratitude to you, Dr. Amit Lahoti, AP Delhi and Speed, for conducting such an enlightening session. And the special thanks goes out to IAP Delhi for their continuous efforts in organizing such beneficial programs, and the commitment of IAP to healthcare education and their support in bringing these type of session have been nothing short of remarkable. And I would also like to thank and appreciate the significant role of Speed. Their logistic and organizational support has been crucial in ensuring the smooth execution of all these sessions. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Rajiv Singla, Dr. Vineet, Dr. Rajesh, and Dr. Amit, everyone part of the Speed organization. And I hope today's session is not only empowering to the patients or to all the physicians and healthcare givers, because the knowledge and tools that we have learned for carbs counting will definitely offer more clarity and confidence in making our decisions in the management of type 1 diabetes. And I would also like to thank all the delegates for participating in today's session and their engagement and eagerness to learn. That's what makes these type of events success. And thank you once again, Dr. Amit, Dr. Rajiv, Dr. Bela, and Dr. Vipul. Vipul is the man behind the show. He's also making all the backhand support, backhand things, and possible. And it's due to his hard work, all the things are possible. So once again, thank you all of you. And Dr. Amit, you are at Nationwide Children's Hospital, Ohio.
Yes.
So one of my batchmate is also there. Dr. Ish Gulati. Ish, neonatologist. He must be neonatologist.
Okay.
There. Okay. And so all the best to all the.
May I request Dr. Bela to make a few comments on today's presentation? Please, ma'am.
Sir, I already said it was
Doctor-
excellent. It was excellent. I learned a lot. And I'm sure the knowledge that was imparted to our delegates or the audience is also something that is thought-provoking, something that we ignore, and yet very important. Because I too face the problem because I am from a government hospital and we get patients who are illiterate, parents who are illiterate. They often leave the treatment midway and the child comes to us in ketoacidosis. So, this knowledge that is important, that the role of a nutritionist or explaining to parents pictorially what they can, calculate is very important. We have to devote time. It takes time. It's not an easy task. It cannot be rushed through. And of course, it is a teamwork. And many general hospitals do not have diabetic clinics. Sometimes even the nutritionist may not be of that quality to, manage your diabetic patients. So we face these challenges. And often the cost of treatment is what deters the parents. They just don't follow up. So, we face our own problems. So I don't know how the government can help us to solve these problems.
Yeah.
But definitely, if the doctors take a little more efforts in explaining to them, I'm sure as the time goes by, the parents and the child, we have adolescents also coming with diabetes. They are often in depression. So we do counseling also. We do a psychiatric counseling for them. And yes, regular follow-up is very important. So, overall, it's a long-term chronic treatment for diabetes. So a lot of willpower and adherence to treatment is required. And I think Dr. Amit was excellent in that, the way he brought it out for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a long disease, and every patient is going to be in different part of the journey. So I think it's important to understand where this patient, if there's a patient who just is not even accepting insulin as a treatment for their child, obviously carb counting is a second thing to come. So goal number one is not be admitted in DKA in those patients. So each child will be in a different state of their journey, and I think we need to help them where they need it. But for the person who is more engaged and is at least beyond that point, can really benefit from this next step in their learning to improve their disease management.
So thank you once again,
Thank
Dr.
you.
Amit, and the speed for making. We are also indebted for making such significant contributions. Thank you so much.